light stayed on after you left. Not bright, just enough to see the floor. It wasn't waiting for anyone. It was just doing what it knew. Your cup was still warm in the room, like time hadn't reached it yet. I noticed how small the detail was and how heavy it felt. I sat where your jacket used to hang, the wall behind me, breathing slow. No echo, no sadness on purpose, just air learning how to stay still. The clock didn't rush me, it kept a soft distance, like it knew this moment didn't need instructions. I didn't call, not because I was strong, but because the silence was already speaking clearly. Outside, the street kept moving, cars passing without memory. Inside, the room forgot the future and held the present gently. I moved the chair back an inch, not to change anything, just to let the room adjust its weight. Some things only leave when you stop holding them. Some things stay when you don't ask. Your voice didn't echo, it settled like dust you only notice when the light is low. I thought about the way you stood by the door, the last minute, not unsure, not certain, just quiet in your decision. The walls didn't judge it, they've seen people come and go without ever choosing sides. I stayed where I was because moving felt unnecessary. Stillness was doing enough work on its own. The light above me flickered once, not failing, just reminding me it was human too, in its own way. I remembered how you laughed softly, never filling the room, always leaving space for something else to exist. That space stayed, it didn't collapse. It learned the shape of absence and called it normal. The floor creaked when I shifted, like it wanted to be heard. I let it, everyone deserves that. Minutes passed without announcing themselves. They didn't stack up, they drifted. I realized nothing was broken, nothing dramatic could happen. Something simply finished without asking for applause. The air cooled slowly, the kind of cold that doesn't hurt, just enough to notice you're alone now. I placed the cup in the sink, not to clean but to close a small chapter properly. The room didn't resist, it accepted the gesture, like it had been waiting for that exact motion. I leaned against the counter, feeling the day loosen its grip. No relief, no regret, just release. Your name crossed my mind, then passed through it. It didn't stop, neither did I. The light stayed on longer than needed, like it was making sure I was steady before leaving me to myself. When I finally stood up, the room stayed as it was. No shift, no comment, switched slowly, not to mark an ending, but to acknowledge what had already happened. The dark didn't rush in, it arrived carefully, as if it understood the weight of quiet endings. Nothing argued back, nothing followed me. The lights stayed off, and for the first time that night, the room felt complete again. The room didn't change when you sat down. It just made space, like it knew you weren't here to take anything, only to rest. The window stayed half open, not for air, but for the sound of distance moving on its own. I noticed my hands on the table, how still they were. They weren't waiting, they were finished for the day. Your message stayed unread, not out of fear, but because the moment had already answered it. The floor held my weight evenly, no complaint. Some things don't ask questions when they understand you. A car passed outside slowly, headlights brushing the wall. Nothing followed them, nothing needed to. I breathed once, then again, not counting. The night didn't require rhythm, just presence. There was a time I would have spoken, filled the silence with meaning. Tonight, silence felt complete, without decoration. The clock kept its distance, ticking softly like it didn't want to interrupt something important that was invisible. I thought about the word enough, how rarely it's allowed to exist. Here it sat comfortably, without explanation. The chair across from me stayed empty, not lonely, just unused. There's a difference. I listened to the hum in the walls, old wires doing their job. They weren't trying to impress anyone, and neither was I. Your name came up once quietly. It didn't stay, it didn't need to. I realized I wasn't holding on to anything tonight. Even my thoughts felt loosely placed. The light on the street flickered, then settled. Not every flicker is a warning, some are just adjustments. I leaned back and closed my eyes, not to escape, but to confirm I was still here. Nothing rushed forward, nothing pulled away. The moment stayed level, like calm water. I remembered how tired I used to feel, trying to be understood. Tonight understanding felt unnecessary. The air cooled slightly, enough to notice skin, enough to remind me I exist in a body. I shifted my weight, heard the chair respond. It didn't mind, neither did I. There was no memory playing on repeat, no scene demand attention. just time, moving without drama. I could have stood up then, ended the moment properly. Instead I stayed, because staying felt honest. Somewhere nearby, a door closed, not mine. Life continuing without checking in. I smiled briefly, not at anything specific. Sometimes the body reacts before the mind explains. The room didn't clap, it didn't mark progress. It simply remained, which was more than enough. I stood when the feeling passed, not because it ended, but because it had said everything it needed to say. Nothing followed me to the door, nothing stayed behind, nothing was missing. And for once, that wasn't a problem. The morning arrived without instructions. No plan folded into the light. It didn't ask how I slept, it just showed up. I left the cup where it was last night. Ring still visible on the table. Some traces don't need cleaning, they need time. The street was quieter than usual, like it was listening. Even the wind moved carefully, not to interrupt. I stood by the sink longer than needed, watching nothing happen. Stillness can be active if you let it. Your voice crossed my mind once, not clearly, more like the idea of a sound that no longer needs volume. I noticed how balanced my breathing felt, not deep, not shallow, just honest. The mirror didn't offer commentary, no questions, no advice. It reflected what was there and stopped outside. A man unlocked his shop slowly, as if rushing would change nothing. Some routines respect their own pace. I sat down again, not because I was tired, but because standing wasn't necessary. There was a time I filled mornings with intentions. Today felt complete, without direction. The light moved across the floor, reaching places I don't look at often. It didn't judge what it found. I thought about the word waiting, how heavy it can be. This didn't feel like waiting, it felt finished. A sound from another apartment, a chair, a step, a life close enough to notice, far enough to stay separate. I touched the edge of the table, felt the small imperfections. Nothing made to last is perfectly smooth. Your absence wasn't loud today, it didn't echo, it simply existed like space does. I realized I wasn't preparing for a later moment. This one wasn't a draft. The clock moved forward, not impatient, not proud, just consistent. I opened the window a little, not for air, but for confirmation that the world was still there. No memories rushed in, no regrets followed. The mind stayed where it was placed. I noticed how calm can feel unfamiliar, almost suspicious, like it's hiding something. It wasn't. The day didn't promise improvement, didn't threaten decline. It stayed neutral, and that felt kind. I leaned back and let my shoulders drop, not as a release, but as an agreement with gravity. There was nothing to fix, nothing to replay. Even the silence felt properly arranged. I stayed there longer than planned. There was never a plan to begin with. Some moments don't ask to stay, they stay, 'cause nothing pushes them away. When I finally stood, the room didn't change, and neither did I. Not in any way that needed explaining. The room was already awake before I was, not alert, just present. I didn't rush to meet the moment. It wasn't waiting for me, it was already happening without permission. The floor was cold in a familiar way, like it remembered my weight. Some things are just quietly over time. I didn't check the time right away. The day felt better without being measured. A car passed outside, slow enough to notice. Its sound didn't carry urgency, just motion. I sat where the light stopped, not where it started. The softer edges felt more honest. There were thoughts, but none of them lined up. They stayed separate, and I let them. I remembered how often I used to explain what I was feeling. Today didn't require translation. The walls held their color patiently, not asking for attention. They've seen enough to stay neutral. I noticed my hands resting, not reaching. They looked like they understood this was not a day for fixing. Something about the quiet felt earned, like it arrived after a long conversation that finally ended without conclusion. I stood up and sat back down, testing nothing. Movement for its own sake is still movement. The air felt used, not stale, shared by hours that already passed. I thought about the word enough. It didn't feel like a limit today, more like a condition that had already been met. No memory demanded space. They stayed where they belonged, in the background, behaving. A distant sound, metal maybe, marked the outside world without wasn't holding my breath that felt new, even if it shouldn't have. The table carries small scratches, records of use, proof that staying leaves marks. I didn't feel lighter, didn't feel heavy, just correctly weighted, like balance found on accident. There was no urge to name the feeling, name would have reduced it, and it didn't ask to be smaller. Time moved but not forward, it moved through like water through still hands. I leaned my head back, eyes open, the ceiling offered nothing, and that was enough. I noticed how silence changes shape depending on how you sit with it. This one stayed wide, nothing needed an answer, not the past, not the room, not me. I stayed longer than useful, then realized usefulness wasn't part of today's structure. Even leaving felt optional, like the moment would continue whether I stayed or not. I took one last look around, not to remember, but to acknowledge that this was real. When I finally moved on, nothing followed me, and nothing needed to. The light came in late today, not apologetic, just delayed. I noticed it on the wall first, how it stopped halfway, like it didn't need to finish a thought. I stayed where I was, as if stillness could be a decision and not a pause. The room held yesterday's air, nothing fresh, nothing wrong. I didn't replay conversations, they seemed tired, and I let them rest. Outside, something moved, not fast, not slow, just enough to exist. I remember promises I never made out loud, they felt lighter when unnamed. My breath found its own rhythm, no counting, no correction. The chair knew my shape, it didn't adjust, it remembered. I watched dust pass through light, not as something dirty, but as something honest. There was a sound I couldn't place, maybe a pipe, maybe a memory. It didn't ask to be identified. I thought about all the times I wanted certainty. Today didn't offer it, and I didn't miss it. The clock was visible, but irrelevant. Time behaved better when ignored. I leaned forward, then back, testing balance without purpose. The quiet wasn't empty, it was full of things that didn't need attention. I noticed my hands again, open this time as if they expected nothing, and got it right. A thought arrived, stayed briefly, then left without explanation. I didn't stop it. The walls felt neutral, like witnesses who learned not to interrupt. I realized I wasn't waiting, not for news, not for change, just existing without suspense. There was no urge to fix the mood. It wasn't broken, it was simply present. I remembered a version of myself who would have filled this silence with noise. I didn't miss him. The floor creaked once, softly, like punctuation. I closed my eyes but didn't retreat. The moment stayed intact. Somewhere something ended, somewhere else nothing began. Both felt acceptable. I stayed longer than planned, though there was no plan that felt consistent. I thought about leaving, not as escape, but as continuation. The air shifted slightly, as if the room exhaled with me. We shared the timing. I opened my eyes again. Nothing had changed that felt reassuring. I stood up slowly, not to move forward, but to confirm I could. The moment didn't resist, it didn't follow either. I left without taking anything, no conclusions, no evidence. Still here, without proof, felt like enough to carry. And for once, nothing asked me to be more than that. The morning arrived without permission. No map, no explanation. I noticed it by the temperature. Not warm, not cold, just undecided. The street below was already awake, but not ambitious. Movement without urgency. I stayed seated longer than usual, as if time had loosened its grip. And I was watching. The cup beside me had cold untouched. I liked that it waited without expectation. There were words I could have said to someone. Somewhere they stayed where they were. The light shifted across the floor, slow enough to measure, fast enough to miss. I remembered how often I rushed to be defined moments that never asked for meaning. To dated Democrats' interpretation, it existed comfortably without context. The walls carry familiar sound, old pipes, distant steps, life continuing without narration. I breathed in and didn't hold it. That felt like progress. There was a version of me that would have filled this space with plans that let them see. Time passed, I loudly, not just passed. I watched a shadow move and realized it wasn't chasing anything. My thoughts came uneven, some stayed, some dissolved mid-sentence. Nothing insisted on being remembered that felt generous. I stood up, then sat again, destined decisions without consequence. The care felt used, but not exhausted. I get this chambers before I consider the ideal of purpose, then set it down carefully of something fragile. The clock kept working, I didn't think it. I sat at the car pass with no destination that mattered to me. I appreciated the distance. I thought about effort, how it usually announces itself. Today it remains silent. My hands rested where they landed. They didn't search for tasks. The room had a shape, it didn't be arranged to impress me. There was a sound of wind set into something unfinished. It felt familiar, and I noticed how rarely anything truly starts. Most things just continue. A moment didn't peak, it didn't fade, it stayed level. I remember days that demanded answers. This wasn't one of them. I allowed the quiet to exist without measurement. It didn't grow or shrink. Even my light seemed unsure whether to stay or leave. I related to that. I leaned against the wall and felt its indifference. It didn't need me. I tried to become important, I didn't help it. Somewhere nearby, someone laughed briefly, then moved on. It didn't follow. I realized I wasn't late. There was nothing scheduled for this version of me. The hours moved through the room like guests who doesn't introduce themselves. I didn't ask their names. I picked up the cup finally. It was still warm and warm. It felt like proof that not everything disappears when unattended. I didn't rush the last sip. There was no next step waiter, but I stood again. The floor responded without complaint. I looked once more at nothing in particular. It held my attention well, leaving felt optional. Staying felt complete. Beyond what didn't ask what I planned to do with him. I respected that. I moved on quietly, not because I had to, but because the moment had finished speaking. And it said everything without saying a word. No. expected, not late, just delayed by nothing in particular. The room hadn't changed its mind about me. Same light, same patience. A chair waited where I left it, holding the shape of a pause that hadn't expired. I sat down slowly, as if speed might disturb what was already settled. The air remembered my shoulders that felt unnecessary but comforting. Outside, the day had learned something new. I didn't ask, but there was a sound. Not music, not silence, something between intention and accident. I thought about the way we leave rooms, how we never announce it properly. The table carries small marks from earlier decisions, none of them argued back. I traced one with my finger, not to recall, just to acknowledge. The window reflected me faintly, not enough to recognize, enough to confirm presence. I noticed how often I mistake movement for progress. Today didn't play along. My memory tried to surface, but it arrived unfinished. I let it stay that way. The clock continued its quiet work. I allowed it the dignity of being ignored. I remember conversations that ended without closure. They still existed somewhere, apparently. The floor creaked under my weight, not as a complaint, more like a confirmation. I breathed in and forgot why I started. The room accepted that there were things I could organize, but disorder seemed honest today. The chair held steady, as if it knew I wasn't leaving soon. Light shifted again, finding new places to rest without instruction. I wonder when comfort became something we apologized for wanting. A car passed outside, slow enough to be thinking. I respected that pace. The walls didn't offer advice, they've learned better. I adjusted my posture, not to improve anything, just to feel the change. Time felt stretched, but not then, it had weight. I considered calling someone, then realized the thought was enough. My hands rested where they landed, they didn't ask for purpose. The room carried a familiar tiredness, not exhaustion, just use. I like that. A sound from another apartment, water, footsteps, life unedited. I stayed still long enough for the moment to settle around me. Nothing arrived, nothing left. It felt complete. I remember days that demanded explanations. This wasn't one of them. The chair creaked again, softly, as if reminding me it was still doing its job. I leaned back, testing trust without words. The ceiling didn't respond, that was expected. I thought about how often we rush comfort, afraid it might disappear. It didn't. The room stayed open, not welcoming, not distant, just there. I noticed my breath finding its own rhythm without instruction that felt earned. There were no conclusions forming, only space. I stayed with that. The chair remained warm longer than physics would suggest, or maybe I imagined it. Either way, I didn't stand up immediately. Some moments don't need endings, they just need witnesses. I stayed until the quiet finished saying what it came to say. Then I stood, not abruptly, not decisively. The chair stayed behind, holding nothing now, but it remembered. And so did I, without needing to explain what that meant. light stayed low on purpose, as if it knew nothing needed to be revealed today. Morning didn't arrive suddenly, it eased in, careful not to interrupt. I stood near the window, not looking out, just leaning into the idea of it. The city moved without urgency, it felt like permission. A cup cooled beside me, untouched, patient in a way people rarely are. I thought about how often we rush warmth before it decides what it wants to be. The room was quiet, but not empty. It had weight, like a thought held too long. I listened for something familiar, then realized familiarity wasn't required. The light found the wall first, testing it, then slowly reached the floor. I stayed where I was, as if movement might change the agreement. Outside, someone closed the door. Not hard, not gently, just enough. I remember days that demanded answers. This wasn't one of them. The air carried last night without apology. I adjusted my stance, not for comfort, but for honesty. The floor accepted it. There was a sound, distant traffic, filtered through intention. I let it pass without turning it into meaning. The light shifted again, still low, still careful. I wondered when restraint became something we had to justify. A thought tried to grow louder, I kept it small on purpose. The room rewarded that choice by remaining still. I noticed how breathing changes when no one is watching. It becomes less performative, more accurate. The day outside continued assembling itself. I didn't participate. A shadow crossed the wall, then moved on. Nothing stayed long enough to matter. It felt right. I leaned against the counter, feeling the cool surface through fabric and intention. Time slowed but didn't stop, softened its edges. I remembered a voice that once filled rooms like this. It didn't echo today. That absence wasn't heavy, just present. The light touched the table now, settling where it could. I let my hands rest there, sharing space without claiming it. There was no plan for me, only awareness. I realized how rare it is to let a moment remain unproductive without guilt. The room seemed to approve a sound from the hallway, footsteps, unconcerned with my timing. I like that independence. The light never rose higher than necessary, it respected limits. I thought about how often we confuse brightness with clarity. Today corrected that the cup was still cooling. I finally lifted it, not to drink, just to feel this weight. That was enough. The room held its breath with me, or maybe I imagined it. as long as needed. The light remained low, not fading, not increasing, just steady. Some days don't ask to be understood, they ask to be noticed. I noticed, then I stepped away, not abruptly, not with conclusion. The room didn't change its posture, it didn't need to. The light stayed low, even after I left, as if it was never meant for display. Only for presence. Only for presence. The day didn't introduce itself, it just started happening around me. No sound demanded attention, even the clock felt damn sure of its role. I sat away yesterday ended, now to remember it, just to keep company already honest. The room hadn't moved on, that mattered more than I expected. There was a quiet agreement between the walls and my breathing, neither tried to leave. Light entered without direction, it touched the things without claiming love. I noticed how our blacks behave when they're not being used, they become themselves again. A chair carried its own history, unconcerned with mine. I placed my hands on the table as if proof was required that I was still here. Nothing responded that felt generous. Outside a bus passed, no one I knew was on it. There was comfort in it. I felt about conversations that never needed answers, only states. This moment qualified, the air was cool enough to keep forest from rushing. Time stretched but didn't pull. I remembered how often effort is mistaken for care. Today disagreed. The room held no expectations. I matched its posture. A sound tried to become a memory. I let it remain a sound. Nothing here wanted a name. It simplified things. I watched us sell without assigning it meaning. It still felt complete. There was a thought that wanted to turn sentimental. I set it down gently. The floor would stay cool, unchanged by weight or mood. I realized how rarely stillness asked for repair. This one didn't. I adjusted my breathing to match the quiet, not to calm myself, just to be accurate. The light shifted slightly, as if testing whether I noticed slightly. That wasn't love. I considered standing up and realized there was no reason to rush motion. A moment wasn't fragile, it didn't need protection. Outside, the world continued without consulting me. They felt respectful. I remember privacies made under louder conditions. They didn't belong here. The sadness carried no agenda, it simply existed. I placed the cup back where it started, completion without ceremony. There was relief in not being required to extract meaning. The room remained open, though not inviting, neutral in the best way. I thought about how presence doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits. I waited with it, no realization arrived, no conclusion formed, nothing asked back. There's somehow that felt like being trusted. I stayed in eternal stillness, felt fully itself when I moved. Not because the moment ended, but because it didn't mind. The room didn't mark my exit. The light didn't follow. Nothing closed behind me. Nothing needed to. Morning arrived without emphasis, as if it didn't want credit. The room was already awake, but not alert, just present. I noticed how silence changes shape when no one interrupts it. The floor remembered every step, but refused to comment. I opened the window a little, not for it, for confirmation. Outside, the city moved at a distance, careful not to lean in. I stood still long enough for the room to forget I was new here. Nothing asked what I planned, that felt intentional. A shadow crossed the wall, slow, like it had nowhere else to be. thought about yesterday, not emotionally, structurally. What stayed, what didn't. The chair held its position without complaint. I respected that. There was a sound, maybe plumbing, maybe memory. I let it remain undefined. I sat down only after the room settled again. Time didn't accelerate, it widened. The light changed tone, not direction. That distinction mattered. I realized how often effort tries to replace attention. This space refused to trade. My hands rested without purpose. They didn't need one. A thought tried to become regret. It couldn't find support. The room didn't reinforce it. I listened for something familiar. Nothing volunteered outside a distant siren. Lost interest halfway through. Even urgency felt tired today. I leaned back until my weight disappeared from my own awareness. There was no narrative form and no arc, just continuity. I appreciated the lack of design. The window reflected part of me, not clearly, not accurately. I accepted the estimate. The room didn't keep score, it never had. It allowed presence without documentation. I stood up when stillness felt complete, not interrupted. Nothing followed me, nothing needed closure. The room remained unchanged by my use of it. That felt fair. Some places don't respond because they don't have to. I turned the light off, not to end anything, just to match the tone. The room didn't react, it never does. That's why it works. I arrive without announcing it, the way you do when you're not expecting to be seen. The door didn't hesitate, it opened like it already knew me. Inside the air felt settled, as if it had been here longer than thought. Nothing was waiting, that was the first relief. The light stayed where it was, not reaching, not pulling back. I stood long enough for the space to finish its sentence. The floor carried a weight, but none of it asked to be remembered. A clock marked time without insisting on progress. I listened, not for sound, for permission. The walls didn't answer, they didn't need to. I set my keys down slowly so the room wouldn't think this was temporary. Silence didn't rush in, it was already present, holding its position. I noticed how stillness can feel active when nothing interrupts it. Outside, a car passed, then forgot itself. Inside, nothing followed. I leaned against a table, feeling the exact place where balance happens. No thought demanded meaning, they lined up quietly, out of habit. I let them pass without inspection. The window reflected movement, not detail, that felt accurate. I wondered how many moments are ruined by expectation alone. This wasn't one of them. A chair existed without asking to be used. I appreciated the restraint. Time moved forward without proving it. I checked my hands, not for tremor, for tension. They were neutral, that felt earned. A memory tried to form, but stopped halfway, unsure of its purpose. I let it dissolve. The room didn't object. Even the shadows kept their distance, like they understood boundaries. I breathed until the act became invisible. Nothing asked me to stay, nothing suggested leaving. That balance felt intentional. I realized how often we confuse motion with necessity. Here, nothing was required. I sat down when standing lost relevance. The sound of the floor responded, then withdrew. I stayed long enough for the moment to stop noticing me. That's when it felt right. No conclusion arrived, no message landed, just space holding itself together. I stood again, not because it was time, but because nothing resisted it. I left without closing anything. Nothing was waiting, nothing was waiting, nothing followed. The room remained complete without my participation. That was a point. The day didn't arrive loudly. It slipped in between two ordinary thoughts. I noticed it only because nothing changed. The room held its shape, like it had no interest in reacting. Light touched the wall, then stopped, as if it respected limits. I stayed where I was, not waiting, just a line. Outside movement existed without urgency, that felt deliberate. I listened to the hum of something mechanical, doing its job without commentary. Time didn't point forward, it rested. I adjusted my posture I didn't follow it. The chair supported me without interpretation. I trusted that air moved slightly enough to be noticed, not enough to explain. I realized how often we rush moments that are already stable. This one resisted acceleration. The window showed the street in fragments. I accepted the partial view. Nothing asked for clarity. My hand stayed open, not offering, not refusing. Sound arrived, then left without becoming memory. I like that restraint. The room didn't echo, it absorbed. I thought about yesterday, but only as a fact, not a feeling. The clock acknowledged time without claiming authority. I stood up and the floor answered briefly, then went quiet again. That exchange felt complete. The day didn't demand direction, it allowed placement. I leaned against the wall until standing and resting felt identical. A shadow shifted without explanation. I didn't ask. I noticed how calm isn't empty, just unoccupied. Even expectation felt unnecessary here. I stayed long enough for intention to lose relevance. The light changed temperature, not meaning that distinction mattered. I breathed until breath stopped feeling like inaction. Nothing arrived, nothing ended. The day stayed quiet, and I stayed with it. Not to mark it, not to save it, just to let it be exactly what it was. The morning opened its eyes without checking who was watching. Nothing announced itself, it felt intentional. I stayed still long enough for the day to decide. I wasn't a disruption. Light moved across the floor, slow, like it was counting something that didn't need total. The room held yesterday without displaying it. I appreciated that discretion. A sound came from the street unfinished, like a thought that changed its mind. I let it pass. My hands rested where they landed. No adjustment felt necessary. Time didn't press forward, it widened and waited. I noticed how many things only exist when we insist on them. Here, nothing insisted. A chair stayed empty without accusation. animals carried no advice, they'd learn restraint. I thought about names, how often they try to stabilize moments that don't wanna stay. This one resisted labels. Air moved just enough to prove it was alive, not enough to be noticed twice. I leaned against the counter, feeling the balance between weight and release. A memory approached but found no surface to attach to. It left quietly. The clock kept breathing in the corner, not keeping score, just functioning. I respected that honesty. Outside, a figure crossed the window, blurred, uninterested in being recognized. I felt aligned with that. Stillness didn't feel empty, it felt complete. I realized how often meaning is added too early, like seasoning before tasting. This moment refused it. The lights softened without asking permission. I stayed seated until sitting stopped being an action. Nothing followed, nothing concluded. A thought formed and dismantled itself out of courtesy. The room didn't respond, it didn't have to. I checked the floor for grounding, found it reliable. Even expectation felt optional. Here I breathed until the breath stopped registering. Time passed, but without leaving evidence. I stood up only when standing felt neutral again. The space didn't react, it stayed consented. It felt rare. Some moments don't ask to be understood, they just require not being interrupted. I turned the light off, not to end anything, but to match the tone. The room didn't ask for meaning, neither did I. The night didn't arrive suddenly, it arranged itself around what was already there. I noticed the quiet first, how it settled without asking permission. The room felt finished, like nothing more was expected of it. Light rested on the wall in a way that suggested it might leave later, but not yet. I stayed where I was, not waiting, just present enough to be counted. Outside distance existed without direction that felt honest. A sound moved through the building low, uninterested in explanation. Time didn't push, it leaned. I adjusted my weight and felt the balance shift, then hold. Nothing corrected me. The table remembered contact without holding on to it. I like thought tried to become a plan, then realized there was no surface to land on. It withdrew. The air stayed neutral, neither warm nor cold, just sufficient. I leaned back until effort disappeared from my posture. Stillness expanded, not outward, but inward. The clock acknowledged motion without insisting it mattered. I watched a shadow lose its edge as the light changed position. That felt accurate. I considered yesterday only long enough to confirm it was finished. No need to reopen it. The chair supported me without commentary. I trusted that silence. I noticed how rare it is to be in a place that doesn't mirror you back. This one didn't. Sound came and went without forming memory. I let it remain unclaimed. My hand stayed open, not offering, not withholding. The window held the night like a still image that didn't need focus. Even expectation felt like excess here. I breathed slowly enough for breath to lose identity. Nothing has to be named. The room stayed consistent, like it had practiced restraint for years. I appreciated that discipline, a feeling approach, not emotion, just awareness. It stayed, then softened. Time passed without leaving marks. I stood when standing felt equivalent to sitting. The floor responded briefly, then returned to quiet. No echo followed. I moved for the light, only to turn it off. Not as an ending, but as alignment. The night remained unchanged. Some moments don't move forward, they hold their position. What stayed in place didn't ask to be noticed. I noticed it anyway. That was enough. The evening didn't announce itself. It simply replaced the afternoon without explanation. I noticed because the light stopped insisting. The room accepted the change as if it had rehearsed it. I stayed still long enough for the moment to stop adjusting. Outside something moved, but it didn't approach. The distance felt intentional. I listened for a signal, then realized none was required. The chair stayed where it was, unconcerned with usefulness. I respected that position. A faint sound passed through the walls, unfinished, like a sentence that chose not to end. Time didn't step forward, it settled. I adjusted my hands until they stopped looking for something to hold. The floor felt stable, not supportive, just present. I thought about speaking, then remembered there was nothing to clarify. Silence didn't expand, it held its boundaries. The window reflected less than I expected. That felt accurate. I leaned back until effort left my posture. A memory surfaced briefly, then dissolved before forming detail. I didn't chase it. The clock continued without emphasis, not marking, just operating. I trusted that rhythm. Light shifted temperature, not meaning I noticed the difference. The air carried no intention, it existed without direction. I realized how often we wait for moments to justify themselves. This one refused. A shadow crossed the wall, slow, like it wasn't assigned anywhere else. I stayed seated until sitting felt unnecessary. Nothing arrived, nothing departed, even thought lost its urgency. I breathed until breathing stopped feeling like participation. The room didn't mirror me, it stayed neutral. That felt rare. I considered the idea of progress, then let it pass without response. Time continued, but without documentation. The light dimmed as if matching the tone already present. I stood up only when movement felt identical to stillness. The floor answered briefly, then returned to quiet. No echo followed. I looked around, not to remember, just to confirm everything was where it belonged. No conclusion formed, no message appeared. The moment didn't ask to be understood, it only asked not to be interrupted. I turned the light off, not as an ending, but as agreement. Nothing needed to happen. That was the point. The room existed before I noticed it. It felt important, nothing shifted. When I stepped inside, no reaction, no adjustment. The light stayed where it was, as if it had decided earlier not to negotiate. I stood long enough for my presence to stop being new. Outside, distance held, no sound crossed it. I listened anyway. The floor felt familiar without memory, solid without reassurance. A thought formed, slow, then chose not to speak. I let it. Time didn't stretch, it rested, comfortable with itself. The chair waited, not expecting, just available. I didn't sit yet. Air moved slightly, enough to register, not enough to explain. I noticed how often we demand response from moments that aren't designed for it. This one refused. The walls carried no echo, they absorbed without comment. I placed my hands where they landed, they stayed. A distant sound arrived, unfinished, like it forgot why it started. I appreciated that restraint. The clock worked quietly, not insisting on relevance. I leaned against the table, finding the exact point where after disappears a memory approached and lost interest. It left no trace. Stillness didn't feel empty, it felt accounted for. I realized how rarely nothing is allowed to be enough. Here, it was sufficient. The window reflected only movement, not detail. That felt accurate. I sat down and standing, lost definition. The floor responded once, then went quiet. I breathed until breathing stopped asking for attention. Nothing arrived, nothing concluded. Even expectation felt unnecessary. Light softened, not fading, just settling. I stayed until staying lost its label. The room didn't recur to me, it didn't need to. Some spaces exist without naming. They don't need to be marked to remain real. I stood up without signaling departure. Nothing followed, the room remained complete. It didn't need a name, neither did the moment. The moment arrived, unfinished, like it hadn't decided what it was yet. I noticed it only because it didn't rush. The room stayed neutral, not welcoming, not distant, just there. Light rested on the edge of things, careful not to define them. I stood still so the space wouldn't feel observed. Outside movement existed, but it didn't lean in. That felt respectful. The floor held my weight without acknowledgement. I trusted that silence. A sound drifted through the walls, low, indifferent to clarity. Time didn't line up, it scattered slightly, then settled. I adjusted my posture until effort disappeared. Nothing corrected me. The air stayed even, neither warm nor cold, just adequate. I noticed how often we rush to identify moments before they stabilize. This one resisted labels. A thought approached, hesitant, then paused, as if waiting for instruction. I offered none. The chair remained empty, not in protest, just unused. I appreciate that patience. The clock functioned quietly, uninterested in emphasis. I leaned against the wall until standing felt like resting. A shadow crossed the ceiling, slow, without narrative. I let it remain undefined. Stillness gathered without pressure. I realized how rare it is to be inside a moment that doesn't ask to be shaped. Nothing demanded form, my hands rested without intention. They didn't search, I listened for something familiar, nothing responded. That absence felt complete, light shifted slightly, changing tone, not direction. I noticed the difference. I stayed long enough for anticipation to lose relevance. The room didn't adjust, it stayed consistent. I respected that discipline. A memory tried to enter, but found no surface to attach to. It withdrew. Breath became automatic, unremarkable, steady. Nothing arrived, nothing resolved. The moment remained open, not waiting, just existing. I stood up when movement felt neutral again. The floor answered briefly, then went quiet. No echo followed. I looked around, not to remember, just to register. Everything was still undecided. Before it became anything, it was enough. I left without marking it. Some moments are meant to turn into stories. They exist before meaning arrives. That was one of them. The hour didn't arrive. It opened. I stepped into it without checking what it was supposed to be. The room felt prepared, not arranged, just ready enough. Light rested on surfaces like it had learned not to insist. I stayed where I was, not pausing, just aligned. Outside, something passed and didn't look back. That felt honest. The floor accepted my weight without recording it. I appreciated that restraint. A sound existed briefly, then withdrew, as if it had made its point by leaving. Time didn't announce direction, it hovered then settled. I adjusted my stance until balance stopped. Need and attention, nothing corrected me. Air moved lightly, enough to be present, not enough to explain. I noticed how often we expect moments to introduce themselves. This one didn't. A chair remained empty, not waiting, just unclaimed. I respected that neutrality. The clock worked quietly, not measuring, just functioning. I leaned against the counter until effort dissolved from my posture. A memory approached and paused, unsure of its relevance. I let it pass, stillness felt occupied, not empty. I realized how rarely space is allowed to remain undefined. Here it insisted on it. The window reflected motion, not detail. That felt accurate. My hands rested without purpose. They didn't search. Light shifted slightly, changing temperature, not meaning. I noticed the distinction. The room didn't respond to me, it didn't need to. A thought tried to become a plan, then lost interest. It faded cleanly, breath continued without registering. Nothing arrived, nothing concluded. Time widened instead of moving forward. I stayed long enough for anticipation to lose its grip. The floor responded once when I shifted, then went quiet again. No echo followed. I looked around, not to remember, just to confirm everything remained between arrivals. No start, no end, just interval. I stood up when movement felt neutral again. The room didn't react, it stayed consistent. Some spaces don't carry events, they carry events. I turned the light off, not to finish anything, but to match the tone. The space held it all, always does. just enough presence to not be absent. The place didn't react as it rarely does. Light touched the floor and stopped as if it knew where to end. I stood still so the moment wouldn't feel rushed. Outside distance kept its shape, nothing crossed it. The air felt settled like it had already decided not to change. I placed my bag down slowly so the room wouldn't think this was temporary. Silence didn't grow, it was already complete. A sound moved through the ceiling, low, indifferent to explanation. Time didn't advance, it held down. I noticed how often we leave too early, before places finish being themselves. This one hadn't. The chair stayed empty, not waiting, just uninterested. I respected that. My hands rested without searching, they stayed. A thought formed and paused, as if checking whether it was necessary. It wasn't. The clock continued quietly, not keeping score, just existing. Light shifted tone, not direction. I noticed I leaned back until effort left my posture. The room didn't echo, it absorbed. A memory approach, not emotional, just factual. I let it pass untouched. Stillness didn't feel empty, it felt clean. I realized how rare it is to stay somewhere longer than your purpose here. Purpose never arrived, the window reflected movement, blurred, unconcerned with detail that felt accurate. I breathed until breath stopped being noticeable. Nothing arrived, nothing concluded, even expectation lost its outline. I stayed seated until sitting felt irrelevant. The floor answered briefly, then withdrew. No sound lingered. I stood up when movement felt equal to staying. The room didn't respond, it remained intact. I noticed how some places continue after you leave, unchanged, unmarked. This was one of them. I stepped outside without closing anything. Nothing followed. Later I realized something important. I left, but the moment didn't. It stayed longer than I did. And somehow that felt right. The night didn't open. It was already there. I stepped into it without crossing anything. No threshold, no change in tone. The room held its breath, not because it was waiting, but because it had nothing to add. Light rested in one corner, tired, like it had been on too long for no reason. I stayed standing until standing stopped meaning arrival. Outside distance existed without invitation. I didn't follow it. The floor carried my weight without learning it. That felt fair. A sound moved through the building, slow, unfinished, as if it didn't care how it was received. Time didn't pull forward, it leaned back. I adjusted my shoulders until effort dissolved. Nothing corrected me. The air felt neutral, not warm, not cold, just sufficient. I noticed how often we confuse comfort with intention. This place had night, it didn't need them. The chair remained unused, not in protest, just uninterested. I respected that boundary. The clock worked quietly, not measuring, not warning, just continuing. I leaned against the wall until balance became automatic. A memory surfaced briefly, not emotional, just present. I let it pass unclaimed. Stillness didn't expand, it stayed contained. I realized how rarely nothing is allowed to remain untouched. Here, nothing insisted on becoming something. The window reflected the street, blurred, as if detail had opted out that felt accurate. My hands rested without purpose. They didn't search, they didn't hold. Light shifted slightly, changing color, not meaning. I noticed the difference. The room didn't mirror me, it stayed neutral. That felt intentional. Breath continued without attention, steady, unremarkable. Nothing arrived, nothing concluded. Time widened, then lost relevance. I stayed longer than necessary, then realized necessity never existed. The floor answered once when I shifted, then returned to silence. No echo followed. I looked around, not to remember, just to confirm. Everything was still where it belonged. I stood up when movement felt equal to staying. The room didn't respond, it didn't need to. Some places don't ask anything from you. They don't ask you to stay, they don't ask you to leave. They remain regardless. I turned the light off, not as an ending, but as alignment. Nothing changed, nothing asked me to stay. And that somehow was enough.
The light stayed behind when I moved. That felt deliberate, didn't turn back. I didn't need confirmation. The room held its shape without tracking me. No attachment, no delay. Outside, the night continued on its own terms. I respected that independence. The door closed softly, not signaling an end, just reducing sound. I stood still long enough for movement to lose meaning. The floor accepted my weight without remembering it. That felt honest. A distant noise crossed the street, then lost interest halfway through itself. Time didn't advance, it leveled out. I adjusted my coat until adjustment stopped feeling necessary. The air felt complete, as if nothing was missing. I noticed how often we expect spaces to react to departure. This one didn't. A window reflected nothing useful, only motion. I accepted the blur. My hand stayed open, not holding, not reaching. A thought appeared, then dismissed itself, unsure why it arrived. I let it leave intact. Stillness didn't expand, it remained contained, disciplined. I realized how rarely we let moments end without emphasis. This one refused punctuation. Somewhere else now, not following, not waiting. That felt fair. I leaned against the wall until standing felt optional. The clock continued quietly, not insisting on sequence. Breath moved steadily, unnoticed, unclaimed. Nothing arrived, nothing concluded. Even intention lost its outline. I stayed longer than needed, then realized need was never present. The street remained distant, uninvolved. I appreciated that boundary. A shadow passed, slow, without explanation. I didn't ask. Time widened. Instead of moving forward, I stepped away when movement felt neutral again. The space didn't respond, it didn't need to. Some light doesn't follow because it isn't meant to. It stays where it belongs. I turned once, not to look, but to confirm distance. Everything remained intact, nothing reached for me, nothing held me back. The light didn't follow, neither did I. The light didn't follow, neither did I.
The window stayed open without inviting anything in. Cold didn't enter, neither did warmth, just air unclaimed. I stood nearby not to look out, to feel the edge of inside. The room held patient, like it had learned how to wait without watching. Light thin across the floor, not fading, just deciding where to stop. I didn't know it outside, the street existed without urgency. No one needed to arrive. The sound passed, then released itself, like it didn't want to be remembered. Time didn't step forward, it rested in layers. I just did nothing. It felt correct. The chair stayed angled the way I left it. The chair stayed angled the way I left it. Not asking to be straightened, I respected that. A thought leaned in, quiet then stayed unfinished on purpose. The air moved slightly, testing the boundary, then stayed neutral. I noticed how often we close things to feel in control. This stayed open without consequence. The window reflected part of the room, not me. That felt intentional. I leaned closer, not for clarity, for distance. The clock worked quietly, not marking, just breathing. I let it, a memory formed without images, just structure. I didn't feel it, stillness didn't spread, it settled. The floor carried weight without learning it. I appreciated that discretion outside. The light changed color, then forgot why. I stayed long enough for curiosity to lose its grip. Nothing arrived, nothing insisted. My hands rested where they landed, they stayed. The room didn't adjust, it remained accurate. The window kept what passed without holding it. That felt rare. I realized how few things are trusted to remain open. This was one of them. Breath continued even, unremarkable. No signal appeared, no ending formed. I stood back when closeness felt unnecessary. The air stayed, the space held. I didn't close the window. Some things don't need sealing to remain intact. They keep what matters by letting it pass. That's what the window kept, and that was enough. sound ended without permission, like it had decided to leave early. I stayed where I was, not listening, just noticing the absence. The room didn't react, it rarely does. I lean against the wall, tired, like it had already said enough. I didn't move toward it. Outside something shifted, then corrected itself. No attention required. The floor accepted my weight without registering it. That felt honest. Time didn't advance, it softened. I adjusted my breathing until breath stopped feeling like an action. A thought lingered unfinished, as if it didn't want to be chosen. I let it remain incomplete. The chair stayed unused, not waiting, just uninterested. I respected that restraint. The clock continued quietly, not marking, not insisting, just existing. I leaned back until ether disappeared from my posture. Stillness didn't expand, it held its boundaries. As I realized how often we chase the echo instead of accepting the end. This moment refused to repeat itself. A memory approached, then dissolved before forming detail. I didn't reach for it. Light shifted slightly, changing tone, not meaning I noticed the difference. The room stayed accurate, unconcerned with interpretation. My hands rested without purpose, they didn't search. Outside distance kept its shape, nothing crossed it that felt intentional. I stayed longer than necessary, then realized necessity had already left. The floor answered once when I moved, then returned to silence. No echo followed. I looked around not to remember, just to confirm everything was still where it belonged. Sound didn't come back, it didn't need to. Some moments don't repeat because they're already complete. I stood up when movement felt neutral again. The room didn't respond, it didn't have to. I turned the light off, not to end anything, but to match the tone that was already there. After the sound faded, nothing rushed in, and that quiet held its place. The question never formed, it stayed behind my mouth, unspoken, unnecessary. The room didn't wait, it continued as if nothing was missing. Light rested where it landed, not searching for edges. I stayed quiet, so the moment wouldn't feel examined. Outside a shape moved, then blended back into distance. The floor carried me without asking what I planned to do. Time didn't react, it stayed level. I noticed how often answers arrive only because questions insist. This space refused both. The sound passed briefly, then withdrew, like it had completed its role by leaving. The chair remained unused, not as a statement, just a fact. I respected that clarity. The air felt complete, not full, not empty. I leaned against the wall until leaning stopped feeling tensional. A thought appeared, then lost interest in becoming language. I let it remain internal. The clock worked quietly, not reminding, not a warning. Light softened, as if it understood the pace required. I stayed long enough for anticipation to dissolve on its own. Nothing arrived, nothing concluded, even memory kept its distance. My hands rested without explanation. They didn't ask for purpose. The room didn't mirror me, stayed accurate. That felt rare. I realized how often we pressure moments to justify themselves. This one didn't comply. Outside, something distant changed direction, then forgot itself. I breathed until breath stopped needing attention. The floor answered once when I shifted, then returned to quiet. No echo followed. I stood up when standing felt no different than sitting. The light stayed behind unchanged. The space didn't respond, it didn't need to. Some moments don't resolve because they aren't problems. They don't need answers to remain complete. I turned the light off, not to finish anything, but to agree. Nothing needed an answer, and nothing asked for. The day didn't ask for improvement and arrived complete enough to stand on its own. I noticed because nothing tried to fix it. The room stayed balanced, not careful, not careless, just like you're in. Light fell across the floor and stopped without checking the edges. I stayed
where I was, not pausing, just present without effort. Outside, distance existed without direction. No one was coming, no one needed to. The air felt settled, like it had already decided to remain unchanged. I placed our bag down quietly, so the moment wouldn't think this was temporary. Silence didn't respond. It didn't have to. The sound moved through the wires, low, unfinished, as if it had no obligation to be heard. Time didn't advance, it evened out. I adjusted my shoulders until weight stopped feeling like something to manage. Nothing corrected me, the chair remained empty, not waiting, not resisting. I accepted that neutrality, a thought surfaced and paused. I'm sure whether it was required, it wasn't. The clock continued quietly, not counting, just functioning. Light shifted temporality. The fight surfaced, then paused, unsure whether it was required. It wasn't. The clock continued quietly, not counting, just functioning. Light shifted temperature, not meaning. I noticed the distinction. Lean back until posture lost its intention. The room didn't echo, it absorbed. The memory approached, not emotion, I'm just structural. I let it pass untouched. Stillness didn't feel empty, it felt accounted for. I realized how often we mistake absence for life. This moment refused that idea. The window reflected no silver, uninterested in detail that felt accurate. My hands rested when they landed, they didn't surge outside. Something moved and forgot itself halfway through. That felt familiar. I stayed long enough for expectation to disarm naturally. Nothing arise, nothing concluded, even intention lost its outline. The floor answered briefly, my hand shifted every time the quiet. No sound followed. I stood up when movement felt no different than stays. Ways didn't respond, it didn't need to. I looked around, not to remember, just to confirm everything was already in case. No correction appeared, no improvement suggested itself. The lightning slightly as if matching what was already present. I turned it all not as an ending, but as a breathing. Some moments don't need more meaning, more time, or more effort. They don't need to grow to be valid. They arrive complete enough. It was already enough, and nothing asked for more.
The moment didn't reach out, it stayed where it was, steady, uninterested in reassurance. I noticed because nothing tried to keep me there. The room held its distance, not cold, just exact. Light settled on the table without leaning in. I stood quietly so the space wouldn't feel like it had to respond. Outside, movement existed without intention that felt honest. The floor accepted my weight without recording it. I trusted that discretion. A sound passed through the walls, low, unfinished, as if it didn't need permission to leave. Time didn't tighten, it loosened. I adjusted my stance until balance stopped needing attention. Nothing corrected me. The air stayed neutral, neither offering nor withdrawing. I noticed how often we try to hold moments to prove they matter. This one refused, a chair remained unused, not waiting, just uninterested. I respected that restraint. The clock continued quietly, not insisting, not wanting, just existing. I leaned against the counter until effort dissolved from my posture. A memory approached, then paused, unsure whether it belonged. I let it pass. Stillness didn't expand, it stayed contained, disciplined. Light shifted slightly, changing tone, not meaning I noticed the difference. The room didn't mirror me, it stayed accurate, it felt intentional. My hands rested without purpose, they didn't search, they didn't hold outside. Distance kept its shape,
nothing crossed it. I stayed longer than required, then realized nothing required staying. The floor answered once when I moved, then returned to silence. No echo followed. I stood up when movement felt no different than stillness. The space didn't respond, it didn't need to. Some moments don't ask to be held, remembered or protected. They don't need witnesses to remain real. They stay intact by not asking for anything. I turned the light off, not to close the moment, but to respect it. It didn't ask to be held, and that was exactly why it worked.
I left without finishing anything. There was nothing to finish. The room didn't pause, it kept its balance, as if departure was already accounted for. Light stayed behind, resting where it belonged. I didn't take it with me. Outside, the air felt unchanged, like it hadn't noticed the transition. I stood in the doorway just long enough for hesitation to lose meaning. The floor carried my step once, then forgot it, that felt fair. A sound echoed briefly, not because it mattered, just because it existed. Time didn't shift gears, it stayed neutral. I adjusted my coat until movement felt unnecessary. Nothing followed, not memory, not intention. The window reflected the inside, not me. That distinction stayed clear. I noticed how often we expect moments to trail after us. This one didn't. The chair remained empty, not in protest, just complete. I respected that quiet finality. The clock continued somewhere behind me, uninterested in sequence. Light softened, not fading, just settling into place. I paused once, not to look back, but to confirm distance. Everything stayed intact. A thought tried to return, then realized it no longer belonged there. It stopped. Stillness didn't chase me, it remained. I breathed until breath felt automatic again. Oh, the hallway carried sound without collecting. I realized how expectation lost its outline. I reached the door and opened it quietly, so the space wouldn't feel intimate. The room didn't respond, it didn't need to. I stepped outside without ceremony. Nothing followed me out, not because it couldn't, because it didn't have to. Some moments end by staying exactly where they are. They don't travel, they don't attach, they remain complete without moving forward. I walked away without carrying anything extra. The space stayed behind untouched, and for once that felt right.
The day didn't end, it folded. I noticed because the edges lost their tension. The room adjusted its weight, not shifting, just settling where it already was. Light stayed low as if it understood. Nothing more was required. I remained where I stood, not finishing anything, not starting again. Outside the street, softened, movement slowed until it forgot its reason. The floor carried my balance without recording it. It felt intentional. The sound drifted past, then released itself, like it had reached the end of its usefulness. Time didn't conclude, it leveled. I loosened my shoulders until posture stopped asking for attention. Nothing corrected me. The air felt even, neither warm nor cold, just sufficient enough to remain unnoticed. But I noticed how often we demand closure from moments that aren't unfinished. This one refused that pressure. A chair stayed hanged the way I left it, not suggesting order. I respected that honesty. The clock worked quietly, not marking an end, just continuing its function. Slightly changing tone, not meaning. I watched the wall lose definition. The shadows gathered that felt accurate. A thought formed and dissolved as if it understood this wasn't its place. I let it go. Stillness didn't spread, it condensed. I realized how rarely a day leaves without residue. This one did. My hands rested without direction. They didn't search. Outside distance held shape, nothing crossed it. Breath continued slow